2,000 years ago, the Romans created the most powerful and wealthy empire the world had ever seen, and then slowly destroyed it with the very same financial habits modern societies are repeating today. They understood something most people still fail to realize. Money is never truly neutral. At the same time, it can be a tool, a promise, and a deception. The Romans followed hidden rules about wealth, debt, power, and value. These rules were never formally taught in classrooms or written like textbooks. They were learned through centuries of war, political chaos, economic crises, and eventual collapse. These were the financial laws of empire, the principles that helped Rome rise to greatness, and the same mistakes that eventually brought it to its knees. And the frightening part is this: every one of those lessons still matters in the modern world today. At the peak of its power, around the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched across enormous distances, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Euphrates River. Nearly 1/4 of the world's population lived under Roman rule. More than 60 million people were connected through one dominant currency and one powerful language.
Its economy was massive, energetic, and deeply interconnected. Merchant ships transported grain from Egypt, glassware from Syria, olive oil from Spain, and luxurious silk from China. Roman ports buzzed with activity day and night. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. The empire's treasury grew larger and larger through taxes, trade, and wealth taken from conquered territories. And the Roman people believed something dangerous. They believed their money was permanent. Coins stamped with the emperor's face were trusted with absolute confidence, much like people today trust modern currencies such as the dollar. For a long time, that trust seemed unbreakable, until suddenly it wasn't. In the early days, Roman currency was backed by something real. Their coins were made from precious metals like silver and gold, carrying actual weight and intrinsic value. When a Roman citizen bought bread, wine, or land, he paid with metal that had been mined from the earth, refined by labor, and minted by the authority of the state. Roman money wasn't just symbolic. It represented physical work, resources, and power condensed into a single coin.
But as Rome expanded across continents, its currency transformed from a stable foundation into the empire's most dangerous weapon, and eventually its greatest weakness. The wealth of Rome did not primarily come from innovation, creativity, or productivity. It came from conquest. Every military victory brought new territory, new slaves, new gold mines, and new taxpayers into the empire. Expansion fueled the entire system. War generated wealth, and that wealth financed even more war. As long as Rome continued conquering, the machine kept running smoothly. But there was one problem no empire can escape forever. What happens when expansion finally stops? Rome eventually discovered the answer the hard way, and history suggests modern civilizations may discover it too. Once Rome stopped expanding rapidly, the empire faced a crisis it could no longer solve through conquest. The government still had armies to pay, public projects to fund, and promises to maintain. But the endless flow of new wealth had begun to dry up. So the state turned toward a different strategy: financial manipulation. The rulers borrowed heavily, taxes increased, and most importantly, the currency itself began to change. Roman leaders quietly reduced the silver content inside their coins while continuing to claim the coins held the same value. On the surface, nothing appeared different. The coins still carried the emperor's image, they still circulated through markets and trade routes, but internally, their real worth was shrinking. It was one of history's earliest examples of currency debasement, creating the illusion of wealth while silently weakening the foundation underneath. At first, ordinary people barely noticed, but slowly the consequences spread through society. Prices climbed higher. Savings lost value, trust in money weakened, corruption grew stronger. Meanwhile, emperors, elites, and powerful military leaders continued enriching themselves, while common citizens struggled under increasing debt and economic pressure.
The decline of Rome did not happen overnight. It wasn't one dramatic collapse or one single battle. It was a slow erosion of financial confidence, a gradual breakdown of trust between the state, the currency, and the people.
What makes this story even more fascinating is that many Romans clearly understood what was happening while it was happening. Their philosophers, historians, and political thinkers warned about it repeatedly. Cato the Elder argued that a society consumed by luxury and excess would eventually decay from the inside. He believed discipline and restraint were essential for survival. Cicero warned that greed could destroy a nation faster than foreign enemies ever could. Seneca famously observed that wealth should serve the wise man, not control him. In his eyes, money was useful only when people remained its master rather than becoming its slave. And Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher-emperor, reminded people that fortune itself is never true freedom. Wealth, power, and comfort can easily become temptations that weaken both individuals and civilizations. These ideas were not simply moral speeches meant to sound wise. They were warnings about economics, power, and human behavior. Rome's financial problems were deeply connected to its moral decline. As discipline faded, corruption increased. As greed expanded, institutions weakened. And as trust disappeared, the empire slowly began consuming itself from within.
That was the great paradox of Rome. The same financial system that helped build the empire eventually became the force that destroyed it. Simple. The larger Rome became, the more desperately it needed to satisfy its endless hunger for wealth, resources, and expansion. The empire slowly transformed into a gigantic machine of consumption. Provinces were heavily taxed to keep the legions marching. Newly conquered territories were stripped of their riches to pay old debts, and more coins were constantly minted to finance promises the state could no longer honestly afford. But every coin Rome produced carried something far more powerful than metal. It carried a message. The Romans lived according to a set of invisible financial laws, rules about money, power, debt, and trust. 5 of those rules shaped the rise of the empire and predicted its collapse long before it finally happened. And the unsettling truth is that every single one of those rules still echoes in the modern world today. Rule number 1: all money is political.
The Romans understood something modern economists often avoid admitting. Money is never truly neutral. It is not simply a convenient tool for buying and selling goods. Money is power made visible. It reflects authority, control, and belief. Every coin minted by Rome was more than currency. It was propaganda, cast in silver and gold. And every coin delivered the same silent message to the people. This empire exists because the ruler says it does. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, understood the psychological power of money better than perhaps any leader in ancient history. After surviving years of brutal civil war, he realized Rome did not only need military victory, it needed stability, confidence, and trust. So Augustus rebuilt more than roads and armies. He rebuilt belief itself. His greatest weapon was not a speech or a law. It was currency. He circulated massive quantities of silver denarii across the empire, each stamped with his image and symbols of peace. The word pax appeared repeatedly, reminding citizens that order had returned under his rule. Every transaction became political. Every market stall, every merchant, every citizen carrying those coins was constantly reminded who had restored stability to Rome.
Years later, Emperor Nero faced a very different problem. After the catastrophic fire that destroyed huge sections of Rome, many people blamed him for the disaster. His reputation collapsed. But instead of rebuilding trust through honesty, Nero used money to reshape reality itself. New coins suddenly appeared showing magnificent temples being reconstructed, overflowing cornucopias, and images of prosperity and abundance. The message was carefully crafted. Rome was flourishing, not suffering. Even while ashes still covered the streets, the currency projected confidence and success. The money itself became propaganda. Under Emperor Trajan, Roman coins evolved into miniature military announcements. They celebrated victories in Dacia and Parthia with images of defeated enemies, captured treasures, and conquered kings kneeling before Rome. These designs were not random decoration. They were proof of power. Each coin reassured citizens that conquest was still profitable, that expansion still guaranteed prosperity, and that the empire remained unstoppable.
Every denarius became a tiny portable version of the empire itself, a pocket-sized promise that Rome would continue growing richer forever. But beneath the polished surface, something dangerous had already begun. Rome was becoming addicted to illusion. Its coins no longer simply represented wealth, they manufactured the appearance of wealth. And the emperor's face, stamped onto every coin, was more than a guarantee of value. It was a symbol of obedience, a reminder that economic trust depended entirely on political power. The message was unmistakable. Your wealth exists because your ruler exists. That is why control of the mint became so important in Rome. Whoever controlled the creation of money controlled the narrative of the empire itself. And 2,000 years later, the same game is still being played. The metals may have changed, the faces may look different, but the performance remains remarkably familiar. Modern nations print symbols, slogans, and national myths onto their currencies, just as Rome once did. Central banks have replaced emperors, yet the relationship between money and power has never disappeared.
And whenever modern leaders place their own images, identities, or political movements directly onto currency, it is never merely symbolic nostalgia. It is ownership, a declaration that the economy belongs to them. The Romans understood this truth clearly. Money is not just economic, it is psychological, political, emotional. Money is propaganda people carry in their pockets every single day. Rule number 2, debt is power. Rome was built on borrowed money. From the poorest farmer to the most powerful emperor, nearly every part of Roman society depended on credit and loans. In the early Republic, ordinary citizens borrowed money to purchase farmland, tools, livestock, and seeds for harvest. Merchants took loans to finance dangerous trading voyages across the Mediterranean Sea. Wealthy aristocrats borrowed heavily to maintain luxurious lifestyles and expand political influence. Even Roman generals often borrowed enormous sums before military campaigns, gambling that future victories and conquered wealth would eventually repay their debts.
Debt was not considered unusual in Rome. It was the fuel that kept the entire empire moving forward. Even raising armies required borrowed money. Generals often gambled their futures on military victories, taking massive loans with the belief that conquest would eventually repay everything. In Rome, debt was not seen as a weakness. It was the engine powering the entire empire. But every engine comes with a cost. Debt in Rome was never just financial. It was deeply personal. If a borrower failed to repay what he owed, the consequences could be brutal. Creditors had the legal power to seize property, land, businesses, and in many cases, even personal freedom itself. Citizens drowning in debt could be forced into slavery. Entire families were torn apart because of unpaid obligations. Social unrest grew. Riots and rebellions were often born not from hunger alone, but from crushing debt. And the Roman elite quickly realized something incredibly important. Lending money was not only profitable, it was political. Credit became one of the most effective tools of control ever invented. You didn't always need soldiers to dominate a population. If people owed you enough money, they would control themselves out of fear. Keep citizens dependent, and they remain obedient.
Even the language of Rome revealed this connection. The Latin word obligatio meant both debt and bond. To the Romans, financial obligation and personal bondage were practically the same thing. They never even pretended there was a clear difference between the two. By the time Julius Caesar rose to power, the Roman Republic was choking under enormous debt. Interest rates climbed as high as 12%. Wealthy senators mortgaged their estates to finance political campaigns and maintain influence. Ordinary citizens became so desperate that some sold their own children into servitude simply to survive. The system was breaking apart from inside. Caesar, always calculating several moves ahead, recognized the political opportunity hidden within the crisis. After seizing power in 49 BC, one of his earliest major actions was partial debt relief. But this was not pure generosity or compassion. It was strategy. Caesar understood that if he wanted to rebuild Rome according to his own vision, he needed public support. Reducing debt was not simply economic reform, it was political survival. By easing the burden on struggling citizens, he gained loyalty, stability, and influence.
Debt forgiveness became a weapon of power. The emperors who came after Caesar continued using debt in similar ways. They handed out grain, financial relief, and public spending programs to calm unrest, maintain loyalty, and postpone collapse for just a little longer. The pattern feels strangely familiar today. The irony of Rome was almost unbelievable. The empire that controlled unimaginable amounts of gold and wealth was constantly financially unstable. Rome did not merely suffer from a debt problem, it suffered from dependency. The entire system depended on borrowing, expansion, and endless financial manipulation to survive. And in many ways, modern society is repeating the same story. Today we use softer language. We call it credit expansion instead of usury, consumer finance instead of servitude, lifestyle upgrades instead of dependency. People are encouraged to mortgage decades of their lives, chasing the illusion of ownership and status. Homes, cars, education, businesses, even daily survival increasingly rely on debt. Just like the Romans, modern societies have started confusing debt with opportunity.
The only real difference is appearance. Roman creditors wore flowing togas. Modern creditors wear expensive suits and sit inside towering glass buildings. But the system underneath remains remarkably similar. Rule number 3. Luxury is a virus. Rome began with discipline, simplicity, and restraint, and eventually transformed into a civilization obsessed with excess and spectacle. In the early Republic, wealth was measured not only by land, but by character. Rome's legendary founders and statesmen, men like Cincinnatus, were celebrated because they worked their own farms, lived modestly, and valued duty over comfort. Simple wool clothing was considered honorable. Luxury, on the other hand, was often viewed with suspicion and weakness. The Roman Senate even passed laws limiting extravagance. Certain regulations controlled how much gold women could wear, how lavish dinners could become, and how many guests a citizen could invite to feasts. The leaders of early Rome feared that too much luxury would corrupt the moral foundation of society itself. And for a while, that discipline helped make Rome powerful. But once conquest began flooding the empire with wealth, everything changed. After defeating Carthage and plundering wealthy eastern kingdoms, Rome's elites became unimaginably rich. Suddenly, simplicity no longer looked admirable. It looked outdated. The aristocracy filled massive villas with imported Greek statues, rare Egyptian jewelry, exotic animals, and servants brought from every corner of the empire. Wooden ceilings were replaced with gold-covered architecture. Lavish banquets stretched through entire nights. Wealth became performance. The philosopher and politician Cato the Elder watched this transformation with horror. One of the few remaining defenders of Roman frugality, he warned repeatedly that luxury was poisoning the republic from within. He described excess as a disease, slowly eating away at Rome's bones. And history proved him right. By the 1st century AD, the culture of sacrifice and discipline that once built Rome had nearly disappeared. Senators competed against each other not in virtue, but in extravagance. Banquets became absurd displays of status. Exotic perfumes, endless entertainment, imported delicacies, and outrageous decorations became symbols of power. Some wealthy Romans even served entire roasted peacocks at feasts, carefully reattaching the colorful feathers afterward so the presentation looked even more extravagant. The empire had transformed military victories into vanity projects. And once the hunger for luxury spread beyond the elites and reached ordinary citizens, the entire culture began changing from the inside out.
Imported silk slowly replaced locally produced cloth. Roman gold and silver flowed endlessly toward Eastern markets in exchange for luxury goods, exotic spices, perfumes, jewelry, and status symbols. By the 2nd century AD, Rome faced a growing trade imbalance that not even its powerful military could repair. The empire was no longer losing wealth through war alone. It was draining itself through indulgence. Roman philosophers saw the danger clearly. Seneca warned that true poverty is not the lack of money, but the endless hunger for more. In his eyes, desire itself was the trap. But by then, almost nobody wanted to hear such warnings. Because once comfort becomes the center of a culture, discipline begins to feel unbearable. Rome's collapse did not truly begin with barbarian invasions or military defeats. It began with appetite. The people gradually forgot how to live without luxury, excess, and endless consumption. And when economic hardship finally arrived, the habits of restraint and sacrifice had already disappeared. Once luxury becomes part of a society's identity, collapse no longer remains a distant possibility. It becomes inevitable. And if that sounds strangely modern, maybe it should. The Romans surrounded themselves with silk, marble, gold, and extravagant feasts. Modern societies surround themselves with influencers, designer brands, social media status, and endless consumption. The products changed, the psychology did not.
Rule number 4. Inflation destroys empires. If debt was Rome's addiction, inflation became the overdose that finally poisoned the system. For centuries, the Roman denarius, the small silver coin stamped with the emperor's image, was among the most trusted currencies in the known world. It financed armies, built roads, paid workers, rewarded loyalty, and connected millions of people under one economic system. The coin itself represented Roman stability and power. But eventually, Rome encountered a problem every empire faces when expansion slows down. The numbers stopped making sense. The wars no longer paid for themselves. The empire still had massive armies demanding wages. Government officials needed salaries. Citizens expected free grain, entertainment, and public benefits. The state was spending far more than it produced, while tax revenues struggled to keep pace. Rome needed a shortcut. And like many governments throughout history, it chose the easiest one available. It started manipulating the currency itself. Emperor Nero was among the first major rulers to reduce the silver content inside the denarius, cutting it by roughly 10%. His hope was simple: create more coins while pretending they still carried the same value. At first, the changes appeared small, but people noticed. Merchants noticed. Soldiers noticed. Citizens noticed. And once the process began, future emperors continued pushing it further. Caracalla weakened the currency even more in the early 3rd century. Later rulers accelerated the process until, by the reign of Diocletian, the denarius contained barely any silver at all, sometimes as little as 1%. The coin had become an illusion, a currency built more on political claims than actual value. The consequences spread rapidly through Roman society. Prices exploded higher. Merchants stopped trusting imperial coins. Soldiers demanded payment in gold, food, or goods instead of money. Ordinary citizens watched their savings slowly lose purchasing power, until years of hard work became nearly worthless. But inflation damages more than prices. It destroys trust itself. When a government insists that money still has value, while people can clearly see that it doesn't, the real loss is not financial, it is psychological. The bond between citizens and the system begins to crack. Desperate to regain control, Emperor Diocletian introduced one of history's most famous economic interventions, the Edict on Maximum Prices, in the year 301 AD. The government attempted to legally fix the prices of nearly everything in the empire: grain, wine, clothing, labor, transportation, and countless everyday goods. Harsh punishments, including death, were threatened against anyone charging more than the official limits.
But fear cannot replace trust. The policy failed catastrophically. Merchants hid products, black markets expanded, supplies disappeared. Trade became chaotic. Rome had crossed a dangerous line. The empire was now trying to enforce economic confidence through force instead of belief. And throughout history, that is often one of the final warning signs before collapse. Modern societies like to believe they are more advanced than ancient Rome, but the core behavior has not changed very much. Rome diluted silver coins. Modern systems create digital money in enormous quantities. Different methods, same principle. Whenever governments create more currency without creating equivalent real value, they repeat the same strategy Rome once used. More symbols are produced, while actual purchasing power quietly weakens underneath. Creating more money has never automatically created more wealth. It simply changes how existing wealth is distributed, often by reducing the value of what people already hold. Rule number 5. When people stop believing in money, they stop believing in power. By the 4th century AD, Rome's monetary system was collapsing completely. The denarius had become nearly worthless. Citizens no longer trusted it. Taxes increasingly had to be collected in physical goods, such as grain, livestock, or labor, instead of currency. Soldiers demanded payment in food, land, or loot, rather than imperial coins.
Trade networks weakened, major cities shrank. Many citizens abandoned urban life entirely and retreated into rural estates, where barter replaced formal currency. Rome did not literally run out of money. It ran out of belief. Because every form of money, whether ancient coins or modern digital numbers, ultimately depends on shared trust. Money works because people collectively agree that it has value. It is a story society chooses to believe together. And when that belief collapses, systems of power collapse with it. Rome's economy was not destroyed overnight by invading armies. In many ways, it simply evaporated from within. As confidence disappeared, so did faith in the empire's ability to protect its citizens, maintain stability, or preserve order. The barbarians did not single-handedly destroy Rome. They entered a vacuum already weakened by economic decay and collapsing trust. That is how many civilizations fall, not instantly through invasion, but gradually through erosion. Not only with swords, but with financial breakdowns, political instability, and collapsing confidence. Once people stop believing in the system, they stop defending it. The Romans never fully realized they were living through a pattern future civilizations would repeat. Yet many modern societies are chasing the same illusion, believing trust can be printed endlessly, prosperity can be borrowed forever, and infinite economic growth can continue on a finite world.
Rome replaced silver with cheap metal. Modern systems increasingly replace real value with expanding credit and digital promises, and both systems eventually encounter the same unavoidable truth. Once the story behind money begins to break, everything built on top of it becomes fragile. Look around the modern world. The global reserve currency may no longer be the denarius. Today, it is the dollar. But many of the underlying dynamics feel hauntingly familiar. Modern economies consume more than they produce, borrow more than they earn, and measure success through endless expansion. Luxury defines social status. Debt shapes everyday life, and governments continue using financial systems to project confidence and stability, much like Roman emperors once did. Every modern banknote carries not only value, but also a promise. The real question is, how strong is that promise when governments can create trillions in new currency almost overnight, when inflation rises faster than wages, when millions of people survive through loans, credit, and debt-based lifestyles? The empire has not disappeared. In many ways, it has simply become digital. Modern societies rename the same old problems with more sophisticated language. Inflation becomes stimulus. Massive debt becomes economic leverage. Deficits become growth strategies. But the illusion underneath remains strikingly similar. People still convince themselves that rising market numbers automatically mean lasting prosperity, just as Romans once trusted the appearance of their coins long after the silver inside had nearly vanished. And when Rome finally weakened, it did not collapse in one dramatic moment of fire and destruction. It slowly transformed into something else. When currency failed, people returned to barter.
When the state failed, people relied on local landlords and private protection. And when belief in institutions failed, many turned toward religion and spiritual meaning instead. That may be the part of history many economists avoid discussing. When money loses its ability to create security, people begin searching for something greater to believe in. The modern world now runs almost entirely on digital trust, numbers stored inside computers, accounts, and databases. Yet behind those numbers still exist the same fragile human emotions that supported the Roman economy centuries ago: confidence, routine, and fear of uncertainty. And if that confidence ever seriously breaks, history suggests that no army, policy, or leader can fully hold the system together through force alone. The Romans understood something modern civilizations often forget. Money was never just economic. It was moral, psychological, and deeply connected to the values of society itself. The Romans believed that wealth was never just about money. To them, wealth was a test of character. Cato the Elder warned about it. Seneca repeated the same lesson generations later, and Marcus Aurelius tried to live by it as emperor himself. They all understood one dangerous truth. When a civilization begins worshipping wealth above all else, it eventually becomes controlled by the very thing it worships. That may be the greatest lesson modern societies have forgotten.
Today, entire economies are built on confusion. We mistake credit for real creation. We confuse endless consumption with culture. We treat speculation like progress and rising numbers like proof of meaning. And in the middle of it all, we elevate the modern emperors of our age: billionaires, financial elites, technocrats, and market giants, treating them almost like saviors instead of recognizing them as products of the same system. Every new financial bubble is called innovation. Every wave of speculation is celebrated as the future. Every excess is rebranded as advancement. And somewhere in history, Rome watches the same pattern repeating itself. Because the truth is, the Romans already performed this experiment thousands of years ago. They built the most powerful empire on earth. They expanded endlessly, accumulated unimaginable wealth, weakened their currency, buried themselves under debt, and convinced themselves the system could continue forever. They called it progress. They called it destiny. And when everything finally began falling apart, they searched for enemies everywhere, except within themselves. That is the uncomfortable pattern history keeps revealing. Civilizations rarely collapse only because of outside forces. Most of the damage begins internally, through corruption, excess, dependency, and the slow erosion of shared values.
History may not repeat itself exactly, but it constantly changes its appearance while preserving the same underlying human behaviors. The Romans wore togas. Modern societies wear tailored suits and carry smartphones. The denarius became the dollar. The marketplaces became digital exchanges and financial networks. But human nature remains remarkably similar. The same temptations still exist: greed, excess, short-term thinking, addiction to luxury, obsession with status, and the belief that prosperity can somehow continue forever without consequences.
And if societies continue forgetting the rules Rome once learned through collapse, the outcome may not be very different. Because money has never been only about currency. Money reflects trust. It reflects discipline. It reflects values. In many ways, money reflects the character of the civilization using it. And once a society loses sight of that truth, collapse no longer becomes a distant possibility. It simply becomes a matter of time. If this perspective changed the way you see history and the modern world, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the answers to the future are hidden in the ruins of the past.